1 diabetes is the most common form of diabetes in children, and it accounts for 80% of pediatric diabetes in the United States. The CDC reports that 34.2 million US adults have diabetes type 1.
Diabetes is the seventh leading cause of death. By the age of 18, approximately 1 in 300 people in the USA develop type 1 diabetes. The causes are still unknown and the cure hasn't been found yet.
We took special interest in this disease for the frequency, complexity, and the severity of its complications. This is Adela.
And I'm Tony.
Presenting today diabetes mellitus type 1 and its genetic component.
So first, we wanted to go over the overview of our presentation. We're going to be addressing 6 areas of interest. Adela will cover the causes, screening, odds, and risk factors. I will be addressing the signs and symptoms, complications, as well as current treatments and prevention methods. Just a brief overview of type 1 diabetes. Diabetes mellitus type 1 is a complex disorder. This disease does not have a single genetic cause and requires both genetic and environmental input to develop. Some people cannot develop type 1 diabetes. That's because they don't have the genetic coding that researchers have linked to type 1 diabetes. Adela will address in more detail, but type 1 diabetes needs to have a trigger to start it. A common trigger is a viral infection. Type 1 diabetes usually arises in children. It usually begins presenting symptoms before the age of 40, although it's not limited to development in people under 40. In type 1 diabetes, the pancreatic islet cells stop producing insulin in the quantities needed to maintain normal blood glucose hyperglycemia. It is estimated that more than 700,000 Americans have this type of diabetes. Another 90% of Americans have type 2 diabetes, so type 1 is less common.
Causes of T1D are unknown, although several factors have been linked. Like much in life, it is thought to be a mix of nature and nurture. That means that genetic predisposition, with a trigger from the environment, causes an immunological reaction in the pancreatic islets. Pancreatic islets are an endocrine group of cells in the pancreas made of alpha, beta, and delta cells, as you may see in the picture. Beta cells are mostly found in the inner part and produce insulin. Once beta cells are damaged and don't produce insulin, we have a problem. Insulin is the key to open the door of human cells for glucose to enter the cell and fuel our body. Without insulin, glucose ends up in the bloodstream. That leaves us tired because our cells have no fuel to run on. Diabetes is a very complex autoimmune disease where genetics play 88% of the part. T1D is also a polygenic disease, and from what we have studied in our class, we already know what that means. There is no specific gene that turns on and off to cause it. Instead, a whole bunch of them play a role. Today, there are at least 40 loci so far to affect susceptibility. HLA, the hemoleukocyte antigen, is a cluster of genes found in the short arm of chromosome 6, 6p21.31 as in the figure. These genes encode for glycoprotein, which surfaces most of our cells and help the immune system distinguish between self, like the pancreas have its own beta cells, and the non-self cells, which might be bacteria or viruses. Autoimmune disease results when this immune system launches an attack against the body's tissue. The risk of developing autoimmune disease is associated with the alleles of the HLA genes in the body. Once the beta cells are destroyed, it will not be able to make insulin. And we know what happens. Environmental impact contributes by 12% to the development of type 1 diabetes. and this is the exposure to viruses. This one is the most popular hypothesis within the scientific community. Viral infections can enhance or elicit autoimmune disorders such as T1D. Viruses can injure the beta cells, and these viruses have been isolated in pancreatic tissue from diabetic patients. That is the reason scientists link T1D and viruses, because beta cells are the insulin making cells in the pancreas. A significant number of viruses have been associated with diabetes 1, such as the mumps virus, the German measles, rotavirus, enterovirus, etc., where enteroviruses are the prime viral candidate for causing T1D. Other environmental triggers include the contribution of inflammation, chemical exposure, geographic location, etc.
So we're going to move into some signs and symptoms here. The initial symptoms of diabetes mellitus type 1 are related to the lack of insulin and the resulting hyperglycemia. As the blood glucose levels increase blood osmolarity, stimulating thirst, this will cause a person to drink much greater quantities of fluid and much more frequently. The increase in water intake will also lead to excessive urination. With type 1 diabetes, blood glucose levels are high, but little glucose enters the cells. This resulting condition leads to a person feeling hungry but tired at the same time. The resulting hunger will drive an individual to eat more food more frequently. Although the person is eating more food, they can still expect to experience weight loss due to dehydration, loss of calories from the sugar that wasn't used as energy, and also the use of stored fats for energy. The lack of normal energy production will cause the feeling of fatigue, which leads to increased sleepiness and a loss of interest in usual activities.
After we read the signs and symptoms, it's time to look at how do we diagnose it. The screening. Diabetes 1 screening is based on a couple of tests which are 100% correct. The A1C test measures the glycated hemoglobin. It's a simple blood test that shows the average blood sugar levels for the past 2 to 3 months. An A1C level of 6.5% or higher may mean you have diabetes. Another way of diagnosing diabetes is the fasting glucose test, which tests the blood sugar levels taken in the morning before eating. A level of 126 milligram per deciliter or higher may mean that you have diabetes. Well, as you already know, there are more than one type of diabetes. There's gestational diabetes, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And in order to determine whether a person has type 1 instead of another type, the doctor may suggest a blood test called the zinc transporter 8 autoantibody. The goal of having this blood test is a prompt and accurate diagnosis that can lead to timely treatment. And Tony will follow up on that.
So the best forms of treatment available really is prevention. The goal is to keep blood sugar levels as close to normal as possible to delay or prevent complications. The most important aspect in diabetes treatment includes maintaining a good control over glucose levels within the individual's target range through the use of drug therapy. Insulin is the key player that will help maintain proper glucose levels in your cells. Types of insulin are varied but include short-acting or regular insulin, rapid-acting insulin, intermediate-acting MPH insulin, and long-acting insulin. There are two main applications of insulin. These include injections, where you can use a fine syringe or an insulin pen to inject the insulin under the skin, or the use of an insulin pump, as you can see on the side of the slide here. The gentleman has it on his arm. With that insulin pump, you wear a pod housing the insulin reservoir on your body that has a tiny catheter inserted under their skin. The insulin pod can be worn on your abdomen, low back, leg, or arm. The programming for the insulin dosage amount and time is done with a wireless device that communicates directly to the pod. Another way to help treat the effects of type 1 diabetes are through a healthy and varied nutritional diet and consistent exercise. We're going to go over some complications of diabetes mellitus type 1. When a person uses insulin from other sources rather than from their own pancreas, blood levels can fluctuate wildly, and chronic hyperglycemia is common. Hyperglycemia refers to the high levels of sugar or glucose in the blood. It occurs when the body does not produce or use enough insulin. Long-term hyperglycemia has terrible effects on the body. It will cause the basement membranes of blood vessels to thicken. This will cause them to become more fragile, reducing the exchange of nutrients and waste products at the tissue level. As the condition persists, many organs are damaged from chronic hypoxia and the buildup of waste products. Once enough cells in any organ are damaged beyond repair, the organs will fail to function. It's important to note that the long-term results of hyperglycemia are the same whether the hyperglycemia is caused by diabetes mellitus 1 or 2. Another serious complication of type 1 diabetes is diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA. DKA occurs when your body produces high levels of blood acids called ketones. DKA is brought on when your blood can't produce enough insulin. When your body doesn't get enough insulin, it begins to break down fat as fuel. And during this process, a buildup of acids in the bloodstream called ketones occurs and eventually leads to DKA. So DKA is essentially hyperglycemia and a low level of blood pH due to a buildup of acids called ketones in the blood.
If you listen to Tony and you're scared about the complication of diabetes mellitus type 1, you can hear me on the odds and risk factors. Only about 5% of the people get to have type 1 diabetes. Gender is not a factor, which means it affects males and females equally. If a father has type 1 diabetes, the child has about 1 in 17 chance of getting it. Whereas mothers of childbearing age, where age is a factor, and have those ones that have type 1 diabetes and give birth before the age of 25, the child has 1 in 25 chance. Mothers with type 1 diabetes who give birth at 25 or older, the child has 1 in 100 chance, which is about the same as anyone else. And as we know, scientists are specifically interested in monozygous twins when they discuss genetic factors. In the monozygous twins, the concordance rates are for T1D are higher rather than in the dizygotic twins. Nevertheless, around 50% are discordant for T1D, and that provides strong evidence that there are factors other than genetics that influence susceptibility. So if one twin has diabetes, that means that the other twin have a 50% chance of getting it. So there's more than genes contributing to the developing of the T1D. Now let's look at a few key terms that Tony will start on for us.
So these are in no particular order. This is just alphabetical order. Starting off, we have autoimmune disease. It's a condition of immune excess in which components of the person's immune system no longer recognize the person's own cell and attack it. Complex disorders are multifactorial disorders that do not follow a predictive pattern of inheritance or have a single genetic cause. And the diabetes mellitus type 1 is a type of diabetes mellitus where the pancreas produces too little or no insulin, which is needed to assist glucose or sugar to enter into cells for energy production. The disorder is sometimes called juvenile diabetes or insulin-dependent diabetes. It is a chronic illness with no cure, but can be managed.
Insulitis is an infiltration of the islet cells by white blood cells following a viral infection, resulting in inflammation and destruction of the cells. The islet cells are the cluster of cells in the pancreas that make insulin. In people with type 1 diabetes, islet cells are destroyed. Only 1 to 2% of the pancreas is made up of islet cells. And the HLA genes, the last one but not the least, are the human leukocyte antigen HLA system. is a complexity of genes. These cell surface proteins are responsible for the regulation of the immune system in humans. The HLA genes complex resides on chromosome 6p21. And after we've gone through these terms, we have a little pop quiz question for you. And find correct statement in regards to the type 1 diabetes. The first option A is type 1 diabetes is a disease inherited from parents where the blood has excessive glucose levels. Option B is T1D is a disease that involves environmental triggering autoimmunity in genetically susceptible individual. Or option C, T1D is a reversible disease if people change their lifestyle and dieting. And the last alternative is alternative D, where type 1 diabetes is diagnosed when levels of A1C are lower than 6.5%. Well, I hope you find that the correct answer is alternative B. Let's look at all these alternatives and rule out the reasons why they're not the correct one. We'll start with the first one, where it says that the disease is inherited from parents where the blood has excessive glucose levels. The last part of that statement is true. The blood has excessive glucose levels, but it's not of an inherited pattern, which means type 1 diabetes is 88% actually genetic and 12% that started from environmental trigger. And obviously, the second question says that it is an environmental triggering autoimmunity in genetically susceptible individual, and that's the correct answer. Option C says it's a reversible disease if people change their lifestyle and dieting. That is true for type 2 diabetes and not for type 1. Type 1 cannot be reversed. Type 1 diabetes is diagnosed when levels of A1C are lower than 6.5%. That is incorrect because these levels need to be 6.5% or higher. That was all from Adela.
Tony?
Thank you very much.